Здравствуйте. I just want to mention a couple things before I go into the battlefield snippet. I have mentioned a lot about the Clone Wars, I think, on the last time I recorded, but what I didn't say about the Clone Wars, old, current, new systems, and ways that they've implemented the Clone Wars that's been going on for hundreds, if not thousands of years, are different types of chairs too, different types of tech, different types of electromagnetic ways to destabilize and stabilize a body on a cellular level. And then also the use of med beds that was used in the secret space program and unfortunately got into a wrong faction's hands. So then there was a battle also with good use of med beds and sinister use of med beds where like a whole clone ship had to be blown up. I think Caspolt's, all his clones got blown up in one ship all at once, which is probably the best thing that ever happened to him. And then the med beds got back into the right hands. But this has just been such a war with different types of tech and tools and age regression to age regressive body, even to infancy, to go on missions or to downgrade the DNA. Or it's another way to hide things in an individual and even put that embryo that's been age regressed into Project Surrogate, per se, and form continuation of that super soldier into the mainstream, hiding their identity while doing that, or with twins in Project Surrogate, implanted an in vitro way to do that, or triplets. So a different type of chair I was going to mention too. I don't know what this chair is called, but I do remember being taken to a clinic room that was a specialized chair that it tilted, it turned, it rocked, it went in different directions very fast, and then it vibrated and it shifted to a certain calibration. And it's some of these chairs are attuned to your consciousness too. And it's a type of quantum intelligence on some levels that works the best in space on some, but you can do this in just a regular office space with some of these chairs too. But this type of chair would pull you out of your body into your regular body or into a different one. It had the functionality to do that. And if you were a catalyst for that type of change that had experienced that change, then you developed a type of resistance to it and I guess immunity and brain elasticity to be able to do those things. Like your brain wouldn't just shut down in your body and die. You would continue just to go on in the continuum. So all of this stuff happens with quantum intelligence and on a cellular level. And each one of us has our own matrix that can be cataloged and filed thumb tag to a very specific calibration to our cellular outfitting and makeup. And this all happens on quantum levels. And demolecularization chairs is the best word I can come up with for this. Those are used for body and consciousness transfer. So this is like a decoupling effect. It hurts at first, and it's similar to like a traction chair in a holistic practitioner's office or chiropractor's office that's outfitted with other things to like strap your legs in or your head, and then it pulls your muscles up and down and vibrates them, pulsing them to a certain rhythm, where an open phase state can happen when all the cells are vibrating on the same frequency, and it would profusely like stretch every part of you in every direction to the point where I just turn a little bit in one direction and then start screaming. So it can also be likened to a ghost in the shell effect, like popping out of a shell, or Spectral, which is a movie based on a real file of what they did to super soldiers too. And as I mentioned before, Hollywood has its own clone matrix, so they can prop up worldly things, steal creativity, cut corners, and then utilize several clones of a single person at once and have an underground city of movies, things that they make, music, and it's just amazing what actually comes out of those, or did come out of those centers, because a lot of the activity was shut down. It is really its own world down there. And actually, people were fighting for popularity if you were involved in cloning centers too, which is a sad thing. So I'm going to get into this next subject about Civil War, natures of wars, secret wars, and how many secret wars were actually in the Civil War time period, too. The feudal fields. There was an ancient battlefield, one specifically that was very important and that influenced many battlefields globally, even due to the recourse of quantum punching that happened all over this particular area. And this was a place where time travelers frequented. They were seeing ancient things at happenstance, like a unicorn or things like that that we just do not see nowadays in these old fields when they would go and view or pop in and out of this specific area. And one field was actually named that, on a fence, Unicorn Corner. So it was also this pristine valley with bounty, and then it had these beautiful springs coming up out of it. And this whole area was eventually invaded by draconian time invaders in their hopes for genocide. And it became this small infinity type loop that had quadrants and eventually 8 marker posts to tour after safety measures were enacted for public viewing. And the real story, of course, suppressed. So one field we called the Smart Sharp Cornfield, and there's a lot of code names in a lot of these battlefields, and the super soldiers that were put into different battles after they had succeeded in certain old battles. Proving grounds. And Doug Pass is actually a name for a type of wizardry and night wizardry that went on, and it also involves dragon courts, but that's a whole other subject with sorcerers and the reality of wizardry and sorcery and true world witchcraft. So there's different cornfields here. Um, One we called the Smart Sharp Cornfield that was near this homestead that was set up as like this tighter square with frequency fences around the perimeter and spiritual radar systems. And this model's tenant tighter, which also goes back to ancient types of magic too, and offsetting that like a tenet square, Sator, Repo, Tenet, up here, Rotas. There were tech wars there and crop circles, Tesla tech battles. This was part of the Civil War area that was intermeshed with many other secret battles too, and interlaced. And the infestation came from deep space, and then it burrowed its way deep in the earth. And you could even look out of this one homestead and see these red eyes out in the field and these black smoky figures in the brush at night. And that's the reality of all the things that happened in the Civil War. It wasn't just people, it was truly monsters and men out there. So we had to inlay these electrical volt pulses and other frequency measures to keep that infestation at bay. And then it grew large and it became part of the army of darkness, hatched straight from the kingdom of darkness. And then the Dracos were black, white, and red. And I call this time incursions because there was also, whenever you have something that's a continuation of Project Pegasus or whatever research was collected there and then stemmed off into one Hydra head for whatever crazy name of that thing would be. There's a lot called Thor and other things. They created unsafe conditions. Say if you would send somebody to view or to go into time like 1,000 years ago into a type of battlefield like this or the woods, and you would see a dinosaur or something like that, a lot of spiritual doors like that got left open. So there was very strange things happening around the corners of each part of this woods as well. And then it grew so much that it was actually hard to contain. And one time, a tiger was actually walking on this dirt path in the woods that nobody knew where it came from. So when the Dracos came to this area, they were black, white, and red. They would drag soldiers off to this trail to this green stone wall that was disgusting, and is like slimy green wall of stone, because behind that wall was a feeding wall. And they started this practice there, and that was the secret battle. That was the real mental hard struggle of the Civil War time period. The Dracos and these evil beings there would even eat like horse manure that horses left on the trails, and they were doing all sorts of things there. The black ones were like these wandering, listless hell breaches, and then the white ones were these weird, imperial, dominating, deceitful body hoppers who could function in the natural through human form. So then they would go and take over bodies of generals or high-ranking officials and totally change their brain patterns and thinking patterns to soul scalp them. So they had perfected this over thousands of years. And then the red ones carried strange fire, and they were very vengeful. And they tried to burn down the hillsides at the end, and then the entire area they tried to burn with this like lava looking red fire that was rolling down the hills and forming in these pools. So this red Draco fire was like, it just looked like very active black and red lava fire running down the hills at the end. So they always, for some reason, try to take over water facilities, power plants, nuclear plants, things like that, things that they can harness energy from or electricity. And then they cut off the pure natural resources first to get a foothold into their plans to bad, rotten fruition. There was even this Irish school where boys were becoming victims, and they were taken to the top level of these windows that were green of this athletic facility. And there was a what we call the Springfield portal or Springfield gate whenever two cities were connected to Ohio, to Missouri. And the Jesuit sorcerers there were moving kids from one facility to the next. And then once these kids were sitting on these benches, they were giving them pulses like sleep tech coming from a utility building and then the huge towers next door. And that would make these kids' heads bob up and down, and they'd have them fall asleep or into like a trance like stupor. So all this stuff is actually learned from what I saw the white Dracos doing to people, draining them slowly, putting them in a trance first, stupor, immobilizing them because they're parasitic. And they'd be taken across these fences to a cloning facility that had like razor wire fences, and tons of clones were gunned down in this area and buried. And sometimes these boys would jump out of their bodies if they knew that something like this was going to happen to them. And I don't know where they ended up, where they went, because you can go to a hyperspace corridor and calculate fastly and get out of your body into another one. And then they would, if they knew this was going to happen, they would do that, and then they'd have to work their way back, try to work their way back to the original point. This was the hard thing in any type of time game. And the devil trying to keep you back in time and pulling you back in time, going backwards instead of forwards. So if anybody had to jump, they never really wanted to jump backwards. Nobody would want to go back to the 1800s or something. You'd have to usually jump forward. But then sometimes that was just as tricky getting back because it's a quantum chess game. So, and also the difficult thing was that it was hard getting backwards in the ocean of time, forwards in the ocean of time, preserving your soul nature, your spirit, keeping your spirit braided in soul, mind, body, spirit, and essence, consciousness, matter, streaming, still intact. And then sometimes these boys would go into a time body that was given a certain bio clock and expiration date to be reset back into the original origin, to integrate back into society later on, just as normal civilians sometimes. If they were successful or found or located, there's different types of radar that pick up people's energy signatures and can find them, that the NSA uses, and ONI that scans things even in the ionosphere. So I've seen the matter of clone bodies come straight from utility facilities too, with this correct angular rate of particle spin. And then the one I saw in a utility facility was contained in a purple hue frequency energy fence that looks like purple plasma that's used to entrap clones into a certain lower state of vibrating matter and keep them in a building, like corralling them, keeping them in that building for assignments, outfitting them with the tech. They go to tech house and get their brain chips looked at and maintained, and that would maintain their functionality, usually through consciousness siphoning, spirit draining, and soul extracting. Because there's only a small percentage of cloning in this type of warfare that is used for good. So the Dracos, they did things like this, where they would put somebody in a trance-like state, and they would somehow immobilize their nervous system. And that was always the first thing to do, because then if a person's muscles can't move, they can't move their spine, their eyes, then they can somehow make this braid with them, this cord, this connection, link onto them, silent with them, and then they try to control them like a puppet. So this whole battlefield area had a lot going on over time. Plus, they also had in this battlefield area this backwoods hillbilly trafficking operation that had one mansion, and the rest of the place was just like hell. And this place was called the Slab. It was called, we called it the Killing Slab. And this was down on this dirt road. And I was taken there as a child, about 5, with Sean, with a woman who worked for Gloria Vanderbilt, and then this plump, dark-haired man and the woman wore these huge, ridiculous feathered hats, and she was, I guess, the pants of the relationship and the head of this operation. These hats were like a symbol of the trademark of the Vanderbilt trafficking empire that just seemed to have no end to these remote places it could reach. So this place landed miles down a remote creek bed in this green A-frame tiny house that was used to confuse a lot of kids. So this area, you could see in the spirit world, like a lot of kids have that ability, was overtaken right away. It was really gnarly. There's a lot of black hanging vines and trees, and you could see faces of Dracos and satanic spirits actually speaking to these people in the trees and in the wind, like billowing next to their heads. Even these woods were very scary, and because it's like they seemed to be alive. They were truly draconian woods. And we could hear the stokion, these tall trees, howling at night. And that's why the kids would be terrified to escape, because there was also down the road from the mansion they were taken to, if they got out the mansion gate, across from that was these crazy junkyard people across from this trap mansion. And then things that were down on this bridge, a guy sitting with a shotgun on a chair in front of a silo on an old dirt road on Wilson's farm, things like that. It was like a whole setup, and these things were used to intimidate kids all the time if they got from like point A to point B to point C, like to think like this is a never-ending maze, I can't get out of here. So some of the super soldier kids were sent in on missions like this, per se, in the Pedivore Wars, to help the children who were completely incapable of getting out of an area like this to safety, and these holding zones. This area was also a FEMA flood zone creek, and the sad thing about this is that the water would flood over the slab and the concrete area where the cars would pass or barely pass because they couldn't after a while. So then the kids who got to that point after the crazy junkyard, the mansion fence, the silo, the crazy woods, they would get down to that point, try to escape, and then some would even end up drowning down in these thickets and the streams. There's all sorts of a mess down there where the creek meets this river, and it's very sloshy. And a farm is right next to there with some cattle, and it's just a flood zone. And some of them would get swept away. There was a couple little islands there. But there was also, if you got to that slab, you'd look to the left, and there was a tiny little cave, and the kids could not cross this area. They would be frozen in fear because there was some type of powerful entity that was like a marine leviathan type spirit that would come out of this cave, and you could see it go over the water. You could hear it over the water, even if they did get to that point to get up this other dirt road. And so we had to tell the kids to look straight forward, to not even pay attention to that thing, and do spiritual battle with that entity that was actually consuming children at that point too. And I don't know how much these people got away with in this area, but it was pretty bad. The marine leviathan spirit. Even the cows there were possessed. Sometimes they would just wander out into the water and get out of their barbed wire fences and stand in the creek too. So it was like something around every corner. And then also running into possessed goats led by this goat man by Typhoid Creek. And these people go to such lengths to keep these just sick operations. Like they will change the structure of a house so that's not identifiable if a child, say, did escape or things like that. You wouldn't believe the extremes that these people can go to. So down there would be a marine spirit leviathan-like entity that would come out from the cave where the creek got bottlenecked, and then it was covered up by trees. But some of the kids actually overcame this. They had faith. They had light inside of them. They didn't look at it, and they stood their ground, and they didn't let it paralyze them with fear. So then they crossed the slab to get over the water just right to get to the other side. And that thing was like writhing when it came out of the water. It was splashing on the water. It had these red eyes you could see at night, and that thing actually did end up, its spirit getting taken away and getting killed. It's not in the area anymore. But sometimes there is a stronghold like that in these areas that people don't know about. And it captured many children, and many kids died in this area, and it was covered up, sadly. So the benevolent faction of the secret space program, Pedivore Wars, was designed to track things like this, like a supernatural file, and go into the worst of the worst areas. And it's understandable that some of the people that were involved in these types of missions had to be mind wiped because of the intensity to continue to go on and to do hundreds of things like this and to be effective in doing it. So if you got across the slab, you would then turn or run up this huge winding curvy dirt rocky road again, and then to the right of this area was part of this maze again, a bramble of woods that actually contained the Mothman, the real Momo, Missouri Mothman files. So then this creature had these red eyes, black, blurry, vibrating type of body. I'm still not really sure what type of matter it was made out of. It's partially antimatter, but it also had, if you looked close, this strange feathers body within it too, with arms, claws, and legs. And it would make these whirring sounds like a moth would too, in its mouth and in its body, because it was always blurry, because it was like it was humming like a moth at super fast sonic speed sometimes. So then we learned to slow that down to make it weak and vulnerable, and then trap it and keep it in a different dimension or reality that it was trying to operate in. So this thing, if you looked at it, it would paralyze the kids with fear, of course, and then they would get taken by him if they did make it that far in this maze, or they would go tumbling back down into this FEMA flood zone trap area of the slab, like starting all over again in this like video game from hell. So the beginning of this whole maze was actually an old farmhouse that I said was an original green frame, A-frame house. And then the traffickers changed that house eventually and made it curvy instead of an A-frame, thinking, oh, the kids' minds, they'll just not remember it as an A-frame or something. So they do that to mess with kids' memories, do opposite things, and then, or they'll like make it into a pink-looking dollhouse or something like that. So kids did escape this area. The escape plans worked. They'd try different things, go different routes if they could. But this Mothman was a real danger for a while. He would travel up different creek beds, and his presence would dry up all the creek beds because it is such a filthy and otherworldly presence, the water, it would defile everything that it touched. So that's why a lot of these areas are still being worked on, because the water would dry up. It would make things turn black and slimy and completely defiled and disgusting. So the part of the woods off the dirt road was called Old Limey Road. We just called it Old Slimy, like the junction point or meeting corners of Old Slimy. Up from that is what also seemed to be like a mini junkyard dump area, because there was all these things that people were dumping on the hill there. And there was a little bit of entangled barbed wire fencing on that area too. So we had to be careful where we walked. And then I eventually discovered the Mothman's extra weaknesses, perfect timings, and I ended up throwing part of a junked out front of a washing machine frame at the Mothman's head, and it sent him reeling back down into Green Valley Creek. So that was probably the only funny thing that happened out of that whole charade. But the Mothman eventually got cornered. He was captured on Holder Road. Old Slimy Road was never safe. Not in my eyes. I don't think even after the Mothman left, the trafficking operation was shut down. The crazy people in the junkyard left. And there was also people at the top of the dirt road that had another little white house. And so if the kids got, say, past the Mothman at the end and then up the other dirt road, they would think, oh, maybe these people were going to help me or something. But those people didn't. Sometimes the kids sat on their porch long enough to stay there to get recaptured and sent back down Limey Road to Wilson's Road by this couple who were really just acting. And we could see it in their faces. You could see if an adult was lying to you. And then so the kids would avoid this house altogether and try to run past that. But past that house on another road was some intelligence and some people named the Snowdens and other things where certain assignments, ideas, personas got concocted and originated from. And there was dogs too up there. And some of the children got shot in front of a curvy part of a road before it goes downhill and slopes way down in front of some rocks. And then other vehicles were getting their tires popped when going downhill in this area, because you really need four-wheel drive to go up and down these hills. So then they would get stuck down there into the flood swamp zone area, or their vehicles would be pushed in the water. So a lot of evidence was just collected from this whole area. The junction of the spot we also called Hasseltime Corners, because of the name of the road that connected it. So we'd be hassled there over and over if we got to the end. It was people and also a lot of spiritual warfare. Hasseltine Road, which also has a Rasputin connection. And it's another grave area and cursed land that no one should ever live on, unless you're insane and like that stuff. But Wilson's Creek was this, over time, it was this morgue of ravines of dead soldiers and alien bodies. Time and time again, there wasn't just one battle there, one big battle. And even they downsized the battle that was even there. This creek got so contaminated and so tainted because of all the stuff that was covered up there. It was literally flowing with diseases from different time periods and plagues and secret wars that got covered up in history. It was like this PTSD spot to never be revisited by super soldier kids until like way later in the future. And that's why memory wiping was necessary for difficult non-mission and mission-related mine snare areas like that, and trench warfare. So when kids got taken there to the battlefield of the Republic, this started a whole chain of Star Wars files, like a princess kid getting taken, Jupiter ascending, lost files, stuff like that. And then we learned how malleable the timeline was and how pliable our lives were in the continuum. And so many rich humans gave so many unfair ultimatums as we worked with them. The ones who held positions of power, we just learned not to trust so many either. Because no matter how much you did for this planet or for the Black Ops, they somehow, the majority of them just didn't really seem to get it or care. So they continually separated us, broke our hearts, gave us unfair ultimatums, tried to separate us. We were used, our minds were broken, but it was the broken heart instances that really tore at the fabric of our beings. But, the enemy had plans to take me out from the womb, even at birth. So this was something I recognized as my soul had traveled far and understood and saw, and it heard and smelled even the spiritual nature and senses around me. I even had an angel appear to me in a water at this area. And why that angel is just a beam of light that came down into the water. And then I saw a manifestation of a sword in that beam of light. But that actually created this type of barrier because there was this Draco archdemon in the woods talking to um, the man that was standing by the creek that had taken us there and was letting us swim there that day. And this voice that came out of the trees, the spirit that was in the woods, was telling him things in his mind. Like he wanted to take us out that day or something to kill us. But luckily the guy overcame that. And eventually this forest changed, the atmosphere changed, the environment, because the Lord will protect his children. He'll make a rainbow. He will draw blood barriers and things. He keeps covenant, keeps promises. So we had this backup angel line of defense with us. The line drawn in the sand. And that this light was like lines of color and waveforms. And it was just right when it hit the water, it was like bringing healing to my captive self. So then it just, when that happens, it's like your sadness, your fear, anything like loneliness or anything, it's just gone. And then you can come back into the situation with a sound mind and an intellect to reassess. So I think I endured about 5 months of that green tiny house captivity, imprisonment, falling into amnesia. Well, that's a whole other chapter of like Star Wars before Screen Star Clone Wars. But the only joke was that I wasn't off world in the situation, but in a town actually called the Republic. And they put things in places like this, like a little black and white dog, to make it seem like a house, but it wasn't. And there was also good stoichion that we found in the forest. So you have the ability to go in and change an environment, to communicate with nature, and then shift dimensions through that. And then atmospheres lighten and brighten. So there's many trap areas in those woods. They're kind of like knotted, woolly death zones of fear and panic. This whole battlefield was like graveyards within graveyards, piled up on each other, markers, posts here and there to clarify in the quantum what was actually going on there. And because there was an element of time travel and quantum manipulations, even trees would be moved out of certain boundaries because they were also used for doorways and portals. And then light beams would come down through the trees, sometimes in shadows, signaling what was about to happen next. Hyperspace doorways popped up a lot on this battlefield. So the stubble field, we called that, was because body parts were being cut off of people because the Dracos were controlling a cornfield. This is before Children of the Corn ever happened. It would throw up in these silver balls that would go zooming and buzzing really fast in the air. We didn't know what to call them. We just called them these silver balls, silver orbs, space orbs. They were very physical. They were sharp. The Dracos would send them out in the air, and they would track you and follow you through the cornfield. Headacre was a name for the head of Legion there. The slab was an exchange point and trap zone. Manley Ford was a drop-off zone for children too. Uplands Trail was leading to higher spiritual ground as each round of the battles began on this field. Then there was a sharp price was paid for noble youth. The wealth and fortune prospered in the bright pledge of the wood and shared wood in a clean white Draco burn. So that's the moral of the story. But the Manly Uplands Trail was full of strange things. Sometimes time is manipulated there to look like it went on forever, like you were stuck in a dark fairy tale and you couldn't even run fast enough to reach the end of the trail. It just went on and on and on and on. You couldn't reach the end sometimes. Another code for the names out there was the guardian and protector lion polished the sun rays as the smart field outfooled the sinkholes when El Gibor, he who judges, shone his face through the trees. So there's also sun simulator battles. Dracos were literally trying to burn us like ants on a field in a hot, dry field with the fake sun simulator, like a magnifying glass. And the Tesla tech had to be used to kick that out of the way because that could be a very deadly weapon. Treacherous. Another area was a tricky area on a bluff region that had a road below it. It had been compromised by this large time demon who tried blocking the path back to base and command center. And this area over time became like a Truman show, like a mini Truman trailer where future apparatuses were contained in certain buildings, and the road next door would be like back in the 1800s, modern old hyperspace doorways started happening there. So this white Draco, for some reason, took over a house out there, and he was very pesky, and he tried tripping us up a lot after observing and watching how we were operating in the natural through the supernatural. And this thing tried to throw us off a cliff once when we were caught off guard and break our legs basically so that we couldn't run fast enough to gain the momentum to run fast enough as speedsters to get back to the rendezvous point for safety and return. So it's physical warfare with these beings. So when that happened, that brought a lot of fear and panic about not being able to get back to the right exact point to recalibrate and to heal between jump reference points. And that was always a critical situation to be sandwiched between the focus of reaching point A to B with accuracy, smooth execution. That was imperative to the survival of this program and multiple projects within the Time Bureau that were going on and moving in sync together. And you were the catalyst for it. So you had to retain your best state of body that you could. And the loss of one operative here would have been catastrophic in situations where hundreds of years were tied to each other like a string holding nodal points of consistency and flow together, working in unison, ensuring that not one node was ever cut off to straighten out the cord in the proper place and time. It wasn't like a balancing beam. It was more than that. A lot of interlaced things on a balance beam per se, like a bridge. And you two people having to stand on that plank together, all together, just right to keep it all running together. So it was like being sandwiched between worlds sometimes, with accelerated entropy crawling up your back and affecting your brain eventually. Because if you stayed in an area too long, if you're actually involved in a time travel program, it can affect your brain, and that can cause severe damage to the whole operation. So you'd have to get your bones strengthened. You'd have to get like shots in the neck, in your marrow, and all over your physique to be buffered, to have per se this membrane around you that was immune to the next attack after you could make it back in time. Just right. So the demon was eventually eradicated, the white Draco in this area. But I eventually tripped that white Draco down a hill because I was so sick of it. The woman trafficker called herself Valerie Reyes at that time. She was also a witch, a time hopper. There's a lot of supernatural invasions that happen day and night for long periods of time, and the game kept getting amped up to win each time. Cowscrin Prairie was an area where cattle mutilations were happening in the 1800s. Skirmishes and people in their skivvies meant people got so hot out there that they had to take their clothes off. Old timey swimsuits is another name for that. You'd see people go off in cooling ponds and creeks a lot. But then the sad thing is that the Dracos tried to take over this area by siphoning out the water source so that you couldn't cool down, you couldn't drink it, and you couldn't use it. What they did is they took over the spring house that was used to store food next to a spring, and this created an opening, a door for them to come through like a hell breach. And every time you would go open the door after they took over the spring and the water there, it was like World War Z. Ironically, because there was a Z on the door actually. And the stones on the floor would shift into different geometrical patterns, like up, down, sideways, whatever. The walls did the same thing. And the walls soon became green and black moldy, defiled, and the place got filthy. And the smell was so awful, it was unbearable to go around there to even do warfare with them. And the voices that came out of it were horrendous because they were taking and stealing people into that spring house too and dragging them down the hill. And then the back wall of the spring house also shifted, changed, rotated. Things were coming out of the stones, and the stones would be pushed back and moved back. There was a large Draco that was guarding a gate there, and it was an active and open portal that was purging out demonic entities in droves. And then the Dracos ended up poisoning the water so that thousands of horses died in this area since they need like a ton of water, food every day. And that was devastating to see too because of all the innocence that was lost there. There'd be soldiers in the Civil War period that would be pulled down from this hill off this fence area and spring house and taken, eaten, disappeared, and gone into what we called the thickets. And the bodies of each field quadrant of this battlefield kept piling up casualties like corn stalks. And there were so many bodies out there that were piling up that they had to be burnt all the time. So you had human and alien bodies being burnt. And we called one day out there the Pajama Hillbilly Brigade because people didn't even have uniforms on or anything, and they just were eating breakfast and just ran outside to battle with their hillbilly pajamas on and whatever type of weapon that they could use. And these people were so brave because they were going up against a galactic invasion intelligence that came as a ship, and not understanding how to war against it. Like the sun simulator, we had to explain to the people what was going on with that. Them trying to fry people like in a magnifying glass, and they didn't understand why the heat was killing people, and it was so unbearable. So then you could see the difference in the sky between the fake sun and the real sun. And the invasion started by the ship landing in the field, and then they had these victims, young and old, that were put in a stupor-like trance in the Sharps' red barn. So this old Civil War red barn was taken over by white Dracos. And they were drugged there after being paralyzed in their nervous systems. It's almost like they get stung by these white Dracos, like they get stung by a bee or something in their nails or something. They have a toxin that does it, a neurotoxin. And these poor people turn pale white, and then they're just ghostly. They get drugged into this barn, put up against the wall. They're just sitting there, and they were being drained slowly because the white Dracos would go right up to their faces. And most people were just terrified in fear, and they just let more and more of themselves get taken over simply because of the fear. But it all starts with the nervous system takeover, and then the brain shuts down, and then other things happen to the body. So we tried to rescue these people we were sent in to observe and eradicate. And then I followed one of the short white Dracos into the barn after whatever he tried to do on me. His mental magic didn't work. And then I saw people lined up, just sitting there in the barn wall, looking like they'd been blank slated in their faces. They had this mannequin like demeanor as they leaned up against the walls of the barn. And they were just like that for hours. They were completely mind controlled. Only a few survived that we rescued. And then the rest were drained like batteries, or their bodies were taken over like they had a virus or something. And you could see the black lines in their face, the black goo, like we saw at Montauk, but this was different, like some type of being we'd never encountered before. So we had to study them. We did it in the bluffs. We had eye gear to do that, spiritual vision too, and in the trenches. So a lot of people were just sitting with their backs against the barn wall. And what we would do is we'd go in and we'd try to get their eyes to move at first and try to slowly unfreeze them and get them out of the barn. There's also werewolf warfare there too. We called the trenches actually the werewolf trenches, down in these ravines and darker areas of the farmlands. And since the creek beds were dried up, those creek bed areas with large stones and even stone walls were used as a type of trench themselves for warfare. And things coming out of the trees down in the creeks. It was just a crazy area. We actually saw men in the 60s try to fight the leader there. This thing was werewolfish. But the sad thing is that this innocent man that was wearing like a blue flannel shirt was killed trying to go up against this creature that had his markings on a large stone that went up to an area we called the Highlander lands and the uplands. And he tried to be manly and he got thrown into the trap that was laid out for this beast and electrocuted himself. So the beast was killed with heavenly weapons, a heavenly dagger that was dipped in sheep's blood, but so many innocent people died in this area too, unfortunately. And the smell of this beast lingered through that whole woods even after it died, and it haunted the woods for a long time. Its spirit was roaming, and so much that a road became too dangerous, and this road had to be completely cut in two, sectioned off with barbed wire, and then this thing's spirit was sealed into the earth. And it's only God or higher beings that can actually destroy these types of abominations, because they're worse than reprobate humans. So as I said before, we learn not to trust the men in positions of authority sometimes, because what they would do is they would strike fear in us. Like if we did a lot of good for an area or a Black Ops operation, then you get a bad one in there, and like Truman, and like everywhere that guy went, that bug-eyed, sinister asshole Truman, everything just went to crap wherever that guy showed up. So you always knew he had something up his sleeve, and for some reason he hated us. And they'd strike fear into you, like, oh yes, we have documents and this, and we're gonna do this with the area. They get other files, whatever. Try to be cordial with you because you're. They know they can't get rid of you. So what they would do was a backstabbing type of revenge. When they didn't like some of the super soldiers, they would try to send them back in time, or just to pretend they were just going to do something or shake their hand, and then they would try to literally just keep them back in time, say with giants or creatures, so they'd be long forgotten in the timeline if you didn't agree with whatever paperwork they came up with or agenda. Truman was a master at this. You could just see it, these types of malevolence and manipulations formulating in his brain whenever you even look at him. He was an awful man. And then Eisenhower was also influenced by him, coerced by him. So they both became traitors many times, and they were unfair in how they classified a lot of things, some battlefields. But I always knew that the right time for disclosure would be in the future, though. And We were mishandled with many other Space Force kids, not even put back in the right timeline sometimes, which causes psychological schisms and distress. The saddest thing about this is that they feared what could happen to them, not about the projects or all the work that was done. It was mainly, it seemed like a personal issue of them knowing we didn't like them, and they feared us because of that. So they feared what could happen to them if we leaked certain information out about them, because they cared more about themselves, of course, than our well being. So we often rebelled against men and women in authority like this, who didn't play fair, but seemed to have a sinister twist to their ultimatums. And this happened in MJ-12 too. And Eisenhower was the one who drove with some of the space program kids documenting areas like this. And it's like he would seemingly offer praise and assurance because he's driving in a classy black car on these back roads of a battlefield, making money flow into them now, and official story come out of him. But we knew as part of MJ-12, even this act was a front in the long run, and we were eventually trying to get approval all the time and acceptance from authority figures to preserve our lives the way that we wanted them to. But most times than not, we were at the mercy of forces that seemed to be out of our control until we had encounters with the heavenly realms who could actually change the dynamics of the quantum. And it wasn't just all the control in human men's hands. Because they were still just men at this time. They weren't taken over by aliens or entities. But every detail of our lives was able to be processed justly and fairly, if and correctly and rightly, if you trusted in God, the ultimate judge, God Almighty. Because that's the only thing that ever showed me what was above this type of tech and where it was originating from, what quantum intelligence is. And the angels will actually teach you and show you these things. And then you realize that the power and control is not as powerful in human hands as what you think. So this ensued and ramped up to draconian bodies. This area, like I said, being piled up. Also, in retaliation, there was lost civilians, innocent people in there, troops being numbered and docketed, buried. The fires were like this staunch copper heavy smell in the air daily. So this place was a stronghold for a long time, and just dark as hell at night. The stone gutters would be filled with blood sometimes, even running down the little hills. And then a small group of USAP units and Alpha Primes dealt with this house at first and kept watch of it, and the future moves of galactic warfare strategies and tactics, prognosticating future moves. We had maps laid out on the table, games. Some good times were there, yes, and memories made. It's like in a backyard area. So this place was like a cordial repertoire that had to be kept for face value show and also to keep our sanity. The draconians that were there, they could morph into humans. We could change our forms too, though. And the advantage, though, is that those who bear the light of Christ and heavenly things see farther and use sharper discernment. And the sharp cornfield fights were about tech. You were tagged, and that sharp silver ball would just zip at super fast speeds. And the sharp wasn't a last name. It was this was a highly sophisticated game of hide and seek, like a predator game, but with sharp tech that was moving in hyperspace quantum maneuvers through a cornfield that was as tall as you. And times that in the dark, and that's the difficulty beyond AI dismantling. The whole area got changed. Like the corn is super short there now. You can't even grow it that tall. You would see victims get hit in the head or heart by these little silver metallic balls that zipped around this cornfield at hyper speeds, and mind-numbing sound waves came out of these things too. Like they had the little sonic wings on them, and you had to outrun them or become invisible to them to dismantle their power signal source. So they were eventually drained, neutralized, and blown up all at once in the carrier source, which was this demonic white Draco. that was running that gambit. And the Draco workers that were sending out these orbs of silver or metallic makeup, whatever it was, to follow the victims like an eye through the cornfield. So it was kind of like these silver balls that zipped through the cornfield were like an eye. And it had a frequency that also attacked the mind too. And there was a bloody cornfield left for those who went into this area unguarded, unprepared, and unprotected. So we called these the orbs corn slicers, but they were body slicers, and sometimes clone slicers, as bodies were dragged from the cornfield and also disappeared. There's certain characters that just did not do what sometimes history says they do, like say Jesse James, King James. They were obsessed with King James, so of course Jesse James had tons of clones, and his skull was in the Vatican. But characters like Sterling Price, that man, he didn't get sick. He was fully possessed by a white Draco Prime master and the leader of an off-world battalion that loved slaves. So there's many more things about the Civil War that had an off-world presence to them. He loved to control slaves, devour slaves, slave holdings, dark lords, masters of darkness. That was their game. They were always the same, and each one in spirit had like the sick Luciferian light as their countenance and a physique that always gave itself away. It's like they were trying to be fancy, but you could just see right through it because their presence was so sickly. In the spirit realm, you can see, like, say, who has a crown, who has realms, throne, etc., the countenance. And the super soldiers that were part of the Civil War period all went back in time to do the work of national security and earth liberation of forces unknown to the common population at the time. These surviving soldiers, I believe, will be part of the last battles on earth too, as this goes back to even the times of Joshua and use of heavenly weapons to wage warfare. But these elect will be waging warfare against the end times beast. And those who endure to the end will only do so because they've been chosen before the foundations of the world, refined by God to do so. And he has redeemed their time and extended their lifespan for his time purposes and will to be done. They're actually wearing royal armor in the spirit world that the spirit world can see, identifying them, signifying who they are. And even the Flash speedster Titer still didn't realize this in the end, because when he lost his director position and exhaustingly ran himself to a point of burnout, stretched too thin, doing things in his own mind's eye, strength, and plans, instead of just submitting them all in totality to the Most High. His service was great at times, but his example was less so in comparison to be followed as a good example. And a lot of people that went into programs like that had very smart intellects and minds, and it was very sad to see how sometimes their minds just broke down too much or malfunctioned. They couldn't keep a core and a focus to flow healthily in a state of well-being that spanned epochs of time that was needed for them to carry that integrity. So the old Sterling Price was also a Freemason, like so many others back in that time, who took the shape-shifting oaths. And they were no longer men, but monsters. And then the Civil War really was about men and monsters. Because before we had even seen Masonic werewolves and vampires of old men's clubs in cornfields and trying to gang up on slaves and stuff. At night, they were coming out of fields. So we were accustomed to this type of guerrilla warfare. And sometimes military facilities and bases use those land plots to bury types of things like this that are covered up. I actually had to dig some graves at some forts. So Sterling Price ended up getting decapitated, is what happened to him, and his head was thrown into Ed's cabin while his listless, putrid body sat back in shock after writhing around a bit on this black tree stump chair. And the cabin headquarters of Draco Prime ended up opening up afterwards as a whirlwind as his head died there. And there were wasps and hornets and other insects like locusts that were just swarming around the windows, like black lines of that cabin afterwards. And it would look like the spiritual explosion afterwards, like a black cloud rose up out of the shack. And his arm was found at the headquarters camp because he was dismembered. And the spirit haunted that cabin long after the event until it was fully contained, sealed, and driven out to not harm anyone passing by. So they make places like this, museums, are open to the public after, way after the fact of making the place look as normal as possible. But he grew ill, all right. He got overtaken. He was even a rapist. The body of that Draco was in that man. He had this pale, white, crusty face with like bloodshot eyes. And Mr. Price also carried a white ivory sword, wore white sometimes, even wore frilly stuff underneath his uniform. These people were so strange. Like, they were trying to be pristine, but they weren't. He had a white hand-carved pistol, too. His speech was creepishly like a 1700s dialect. Like, he was trying to be puffed up in pride and imperially evil at the same time. But it was a conundrum, and we just called him a fat white bastard in the end, due to the nature of the Civil War causes. Not many people back then could see Dracos in human form, but when they did, they didn't know how to react intelligently, and it would usually be too late for them after the fact. So that's another reason why there are super soldiers who have the knowledge, who have the training, and who have the mind skill and sets to be able to just go in an area and completely help a catastrophic event from happening, even though catastrophic things still do happen in history and time, but not to the extent and level that it could have gotten away with and capped at and contained at. So many men died in this battlefield. The thousands are never going to be known, the number of them. One man was named after a lion, and we watched him get eaten by a pride of what could be likened to lions, but much worse. This was an area that had field stones and red hues on the grass, and cactuses were planted there so that they had some water to survive with. And he was piled up on the worst looking, he was piled up on top of and ganged up by the worst looking Dracos we'd ever seen in our lives. And they hid in these brambles and piles of deep wooded brush and areas and came out like ghillie suits. And that's what killed him. Some of the characters in the Civil War period were undercover. So that also broke our hearts when a gruesome display of evil was viewed by our team. So the code names that were used on this epicenter of the Battlefield Republic were influential across all timelines, dimensions, and space of every battlefield. And this started a chain reaction and started the preservation of certain battlefields to hold space for quantum discharges too. And we learned a lot from this area, the thickets, the faces in the woods. Sinkholes came in this area, swallowed up the rest of them, and that was a godly thing, like pests in this hive that they just sunk down into the earth where they belonged, in the belly of a void that got shut up for good after they killed Lion. And it was like a net laid out, and in God's humor, after the gang of Dracos killed Officer Lion, the sinkhole appeared as a mass grave next to a place named after a man's last name, meaning the fool. Because Lion knew that he was appointed by God to do a task like this, and they hated him the most. So he was actually fighting to free slaves, and they became, I guess, in a sense, became ballistic batteries after this, supercharged by Holy Spirit power and wind and might, and quickened by the mind of Christ. And we could see through these trails like dark, smoky faces on the sides of the trails where the wagons would go up sometimes, and the bushes. They were like hellish faces that looked like lava was falling off their faces, that were making sounds out of their mouths, like they were taunting us about all that had happened on this battlefield. And it's like these reddish eyes were looking out from these faces as the wagons went past them, like dripping hellfire from their mouths and eyes, like ashes smoldering in the bushes with murmuring voices. So these voices would taunt us about what they had gotten away with already and remind us of it and laugh amongst themselves. Um, Dave Morrow was taken into one path and he ended up killing a giant there. And then we ended up finding and killing a giant's kid that had this lopsided head and a busted up eye, because he would come up from this huge stone all the time by this creek bed. And then another time we had to roll down these huge boulders down a hill by a bridge and end up smashing giants there that were trying to win dominion over this contested area too. So there was that factor. We'd already been in the future, so we could make weapons that were highly sophisticated and timed with precision accuracy to get the job done, to mess with their electromagnetic fields at the same time, like mini solar flares, hyperspace tech, etc., to knock them out. So we saw things in this field, I said, from 1,000 years ago. Lots of anomalies were there due to, as a result to the jumping of timelines. And that acted like a wire. And if something happened, this is hard to explain, about how I saw people going sideways in time and moving or shifting or jumping to a side timeline and changing the whole trajectory of the original path. So we ended up calling these things walk the wire to keep it straight. And then things appeared in the woods like portal breaches. Like I said, there was a short, stout dinosaur we saw in this woods that was walking around, and we ended up flipping it upside down, trapping it in a pit, and then cutting its foot off, which got petrified, and it's a split hoof-looking large stone there now. There's markers in the area. The werewolf was buried there in front of a graveyard. But the thing with this one is that it had a tree growing out from it, which was a terrible idea. And this tree had the life sucked out of it. And then slowly over time, that werewolf spirit and consciousness of the werewolf latched onto this growing tree and literally biologically somehow meshed itself within it. And it was trying to upbraid with it and resurrect itself from the strength of the tree. And it was a frightening sight to see. And the area had to be sectioned off, like I said, because of what came out of the tree and electrically fenced off. And the tree was cut down, cauterized, and then that body was moved to another location where tons of hornets ended up coming out. But there was also a lot of victories in the Civil War time period. The motto was to never run, to give them thunder, to continue onward to victory, to move like flash, operate 3 cannons at once, have hyper-infused oxygenated nanowater to stay alive and hydrated that would be calibrated to the super soldiers' bodies, to each cell. And that would allow you to not be thirsty or hungry. So then you could go for, say, 8 to 16-hour stretches on a battlefield doing the work of 10 men. And then if somebody asked you, like, what was in your canteen, you could tell them, like, it was some special tincture from a herb that was very rare. But the energy ropes that the Dracos were using to, like, fish and reel people in, it was like pulling, I can only describe this as like pulling you down a hill on a conveyor belt with invisible light spectrums and an electromagnetic flip trick down into these thickets. And if you got down into those thickets, you were a goner if you were down there, because those thickets were like a feeding zone. And it took, when they tried it on me, all my energy to dig my heels into the soil on the hill and not be pulled down by psionic pulses coming from the short, white, ugly Dracos that were just standing down at the bottom of the hill, like flipping their head at you. Grown men were just being pulled right down the hill easily, like on an invisible fish line. They had taken over this entire square, and this type of warfare they'd already laid the foundation for. This alien warfare, it paralyzed your nervous system, so you had to fight it with a spiritual strength that comes from the belly and the mind working together to offset its waves and blows and flip it completely around. And this place was an alien war zone. And you could see different layers and time layers in the atmosphere. You could reverse energy patterns that dark crafts laid into the field and spiral it back out into the aethers, because you could see multiple dimensions responding and creating a good outcome to the super soldiers when they extended and expended these measures. And we're in pure higher vibrating forms, obviously, of their creation than the white Dracos were. So this created a different buffering and preparation in the atmosphere so that the ship couldn't break through a light threshold. It couldn't try to come back and land because they lay a foundation, they know what they're doing, and Legion is harder to get rid of because it tries to come in again and again, and it brings more each time. So you don't even get an opportunity to lay that foundation. But by the time we got to this battlefield, it was too late. So you reverse the pattern, and their imprint that they left on the field, we had to flip and completely dissolve and send back, so that if they tried to land in that spot in that field again, they were not able to. They couldn't break through a light threshold that we had inlaid and spiraled back out. And they couldn't take root or infect the area again, but they would be repelled back. And then research was done on this as well to be able to do that. Say, like if somebody tries to land a helicopter on the White House, it's immediately just repelled back. Invisible, silent warfare. So there were also reptilian human men laying on the outskirts of the square at night that were, I mean, there was bodies everywhere, just polluting the creeks by the barbed wire fences. It was complete warfare. Nobody could escape the square. And the first battle propelled us into other similar battles, but nothing like what happened at this original war arena and theater of Wilson's Creek. Some days were slaughters, and other days were like victories, driving the alien threat back further and further, cutting it shorter, lessening their numbers, lessening their power, until the last one was hunted and burned like the disease and cancer that they were. They were like ticks in the woods. We formed a secret group, secret alliance, that held all the data from the times, say, to the Knights of the Round Table area, which was a galactic tribal war history, also of bloodlines, into 2 roads called Union Chapel, too. And then we tracked Jesuit secret meetings there, stopped them from taking over certain springs and poisoning areas to commit genocide, which seemed to always be their plan. And the Union Chapel meetings offset a lot of the Dark Lord's plans as a result. Ancient supernatural areas of X-Files. Loops, time walls. And the tech was so advanced that you could actually cheat on the battlefield, go through a time wall from the 1700s, 1800s, into the future facility, get a bag of ice, use the air conditioner, and then go back into the 1800s amazingly, and amaze them and help the civilians with items like ice or other things. You could just say you invented something, and the time wall things are very crazy. I just pretended I was an old-fashioned person, dressed up old-fashioned, because I was obsessed with that when I went to the facility museum because of my love for history or something. But what we would do is we would give them modern solutions to things like wrapping their legs in insect repellent, tinctures, salves, the cactuses we planted, have emergency water supplies on hand, put ice on their handkerchiefs. So the time anomalies, there also ended up being like a huge black wolf that was this time anomaly that was killing deer and livestock and stalking certain individuals through time out there. And it's much like the one in the Never-Ending Story. And he was sent back to the void where he belonged to. And the natives that also marched on this battlefield and fought in this war as well, which the Native Americans never got credit for this. They saw the things like this. And when that wolf got killed, we actually made a wolf's teeth necklace out of it and gave it to the Native American leader there for a peace offering. So we had modern ways to communicate with one another. But what was out there at the end was more like control panels when the tech was brought in and the field positions, waiting for the grand finale to eradicate the Draco invasion of the square. And the actual grand finale of the whole Civil War arenas and theaters was Sailor's Creek. The fences that were up there, they were full. They were full of Draco blood, and there was thick, black, dripping, toxic black goo blood and guts and brains that even had like human casualties laying across the fence posts. So it was alien and human bodies together. That coupled with the human and alien body burnings, it was horrific. And that's the fences out there, they're all replaced replicas. Um, you had to offset the smell with like these created perfumes so your head wouldn't spin. And the white Dracos that took over the Sharp's house that had sharp little teeth, they had mutated little bodies. They were pretty nasty and cruel and vindictive. It's like these things they get off on tripping you up to go backwards in time or something, to stick you in like a quantum hallway conveyor belt and then laugh at it. That's where their mindset is. That's why I ended up tripping one down the hill that day. I kind of blipped out of its perception gap zone and then tripped it down the hill, and this white Draco ended up rolling down the dusty, rocky dirt hill, and it hit its head on a rock and it was screaming. And then we ended up beating it with logs. But that's the way they work. They are, they never give up. They're like, they hone in on something, they paralyze it, and they just drain it dry and use their conveyor belt type scalar pulsing EM energy scalar waves to drag, pull fish victims and devour them. These are the lowest of created beings in what they do and feed off of. Like albino Dracos is what these things were. And the entire gross energy of the warfield had to be cleansed for a long, long period of time and purified over hundreds of years to finally be safe. And one of the last days was very celestial, though, actually. A beacon ended up getting activated as the last command control panel post, and a Tesla like post with a ball on top of it was hidden by a tree down at the bottom of a field. It was more like a Tesla coil, but it was a scalar pulse beam weapon that was connected to a space fleet of the super secret space program to amplify, disperse, discharge, and displace any target in a large scale manner. And the white light burst onto the entire square of the woods when activated in this pure piezoelectric and purplish lavender energy pulse like ball lightning, like ozone smell, splitting in all different directions, crackling through the thick, dense energy of the battlefield, and it just permeated and affected everything that was living there. So birds could come back there and chirp, and things could get eventually back to normal. And the people that were left there, they were getting medical care, their hearts kind of like jumped a beat, their minds were amplified, and it ended up burning out the black goo in the people that were left there, which was a great thing. The skylines changed, the clouds changed, the rain started pouring, the smell of fresh dew was resting upon this peaceful but terrifying looking arena. So it was definitely a sight to behold. Some people saw visions in the sky, like the end game of heaven. So at the end of this huge battlefield, it was like a gamma burst of the activated beacon that secured our success in the timeline and elimination of this Draco off-world threat, or whatever this was, a mutation of them, or created manufacture being drop-off fleet of them. I'm still not sure about the origin, but all I know is that they're satanic. They seek to steal, kill, and destroy everything. They're catastrophically diabolical and wicked from the pit of hell, and they should stay there forever where they belong. Because we saw the results of their kingdom advancing on this battlefield, and in the faces of the horizons, even in the clouds, the trees, their spiritual signature and filth will affect an area for miles. So we had to use test the weapons against them, and the booms were so loud they could be heard from nearby cities even. These things control human minds, child slave minds. They keep them in their trap spells until God's light can actually come and break through and rescue anything innocent that's left over if they take a body that's caught in their fowler snares. And they also brought snakes with them into the fields. And that was another infestation the soldiers had to deal with, black snakes. And the pain and suffering is just unbelievable. The things that those people had to go through in that time period, the clothes they wore, the rawness of the spirit, and the Confederate time period, just to keep scraping by with what was available to them, and the sacrifice that they were willing to give and what it cost them. It was just unprecedented. So after securing perimeters of electrical shocks, neutralizations in the ground around the trees, we had many reptilian bonfires blazing at the end. Draconian, pretty much. The red line was the dividing lines between us and them. We actually had a red line too there with some tech that knocked them out and burnt out their systems if they crossed this red line, because they kept advancing numerous times, and we kept getting cornered in different areas of the battlefield, and these battles continued step by step until the very last one was blotted out. And then the fields were searched, they got scorched, and we made sure that not one egg or residue or shadow of one remained, and that all that was left afterwards was like basically phantom pulses, spirits, anomalies, the normal quantum entanglements that you get in areas like this that usually forms a triangular zone or a square. And then you see this stuff in interdimensional, intergalactic warfare. So because it does bend time and space and reality and the fabrics in between. And many portals were opened in other areas. And that tiger that ended up coming out and walking down a road scared the troops at first, but then it was friendly because you could learn how to communicate animals the right way sometimes, and everything was advanced to be able to do stuff like that when you were in an activated and fully functioning body that had no DNA downgrading done to it, basically. So at the end, it was like what we saw was all of them falling down in this last stand, positioned like zapped bugs. They'd gotten away with dragging away and eating a lot of humans, but their time was over. Because they're bloodthirsty entities, and they hated the oaks so much that they tried to burn them all down, because the strong oaks represent strong pillars, columns that the Bible speaks of as the children of God that hold the line for heaven, and they're guarded, nurtured, weeded, fed, and watered by the Father's hand, planted by living water and streams from the throne room to become righteous oaks in his sight. So it was the battle of oaks for that reason too. They're unmoved, unchanged, unharmed, and always moving forward in God's time until the Messianic reign. And at the end, God's face, Yahushua's face, became the actual sun that we knew would sustain us eternally. When you moved the sun simulator out of the way, his peace rested on that battlefield's last days, and was the vision and the foreshadow, actually like a vision in the sky, is what some people saw of the Prince of Peace's return on his final battlefield of Jerusalem. And he can turn a place like that, when his presence shows up, into a place where his peace can rest on, and he brings the shalom. The spring was healed of its black goo, and when the last men on the battlefield were dying of thirst, prayers went up. We fixed a pump on the spring, hit it with a scalar beam, and it was like God was holy laughing with you as the spring burst up. And there was so much water, it was like a pool. So then people got to bathe and swim in this little pool there, and they were refreshed and full and happy at the end. And the rain was there too, so it was a beautiful sight. And the Lord sees leaders on earth only as kings, he says. So he moves the kings around like water between his fingers. So the white Dracos that think they're kings, he can just move them too. And he was with us that last day, and he delighted in turning bad things into good. And he gave us the power and authority to be able to speak to giants, the giants that were there in the past, and to be able to actually stand on their shoulders. So that's where we got the term standing on the shoulders of giants, because we'd actually go on the giant shoulders, look out on the field to see what they were seeing, because they were watching a lot of Battlefield too, the Giants, and actually not getting involved for a while. And they had been there for a long time. So the Lord's hand was through that battlefield, and I guess I can just say that he was there with us that last day. He delighted in turning bad things into good things and showing us some good fruit that can come out of that. He could operate through us into the realm of the miraculous when we allow him to take out factions, to take out sinister things, because Judges 5:10 says the stars of Sisera even fought and battled in their courses. So the war in heaven is something that we all should remember, but the veil is so thick here that most humans forget, and they forget the true nature of God and the goodness of their Heavenly Father and heavenly parentage. And he is the King of Kings because he appoints kings sometimes, and he has appointed a king to destroy the New World Order, even to be a tool in his hands, because the name Donald means world ruler, and he wants to use him to destroy the one world order. And I also give credit and thanks for my rightfully and duly elected president, Donald J. Trump, the president of the Republic of the United States of America, also for helping some of these battlefields through time and having a secret history with being part of the good Secret Space Force faction. And I pray for his safety and protection, and that he continues to do so and stays genuine and true in character, and will always be a good leader to look up to. Shalom.